Anyone else feeling a little entombed? All this social distancing and self-quarantine can make us feel sealed off from the world. I especially think of those of you who live by yourselves. No one to sit down with at the end of the day. No human touch, not even a handshake. Anyone else feel like their loved ones have been sealed away from you? You may have particular people you're worried about, people you would normally go running to help, yet right now to show up physically is to potentially endanger them. I worry about my older family members, but I can't go to their aid. I have a new grandchild due in another week, but we can't go to meet her or to help out with her care. You too, I know, want to be there for the ones you love, and you can't be. We have members who are sick. We have older people who live alone, and we can't go visit. The first time I preached on this passage of the raising of Lazarus, I was doing a seminary internship as a hospital chaplain. I'd spent the night with a family at the bedside of their 10-year-old who had suffered a sudden aneurysm while she was on an amusement park ride. That morning, she'd been fine. That night, she was brain dead. Her parents stood there sobbing and calling her name as the doctors unplugged the ventilator and we watched her stop breathing. And then I had to go downstairs to the hospital chapel, and the scripture passage for the day was the story of Lazarus. This story where Jesus calls his name and Lazarus steps out of the tomb alive. Ever since that day, I've kind of hated this story. I've hated it because it seems to hold out a promise that I can't fulfill. There are all kinds of tombs that people get sealed inside, even before this virus. I'm guessing that, like me, you have stood outside a few of those tombs trying to call a loved one out, only to be met with silence. There are the literal deaths that we'd like to undo, but there are also the equally heartbreaking, gut-wrenching deaths of addiction or depression or dementia, where the person is still physically alive, but we can't reach them no matter how hard we try. So this story of the raising of Lazarus seems somehow unhelpful and even cruel. Or did, until I realized that it's not really about Lazarus. And it's not even about saving someone from death. Consider that Jesus deliberately didn't help Lazarus avoid death. He let him die, and Lazarus was really dead. So dead that he was starting to decompose. Not only that, but there's nothing in the story to suggest that after Jesus raised him, Lazarus became immortal, which means that at some point, Lazarus had to die again. So then, what's the point? Why did Jesus first let Lazarus die and then call him out of the tomb? He did it for Martha. He did it for Mary. He did it for the whole grieving community, not to solve the problem of death, but as a sign. But a sign of what? Well, it's no accident that John places this story here, at this point in the gospel where the cross is looming so large. He is preparing us for the fact that Jesus, too, will have to die, will even choose to die. Coming back to Bethany to comfort Martha and Mary in their grief, back to the place where the authorities were already plotting to get him, actually made Jesus' death that much more inevitable, and he knew it. Like Lazarus, Jesus, too, will die, and he will be truly dead, but he won't stay that way. like any of us does when a loved one is in danger. Martha and Mary spent Lazarus' illness frantically trying to save him. And when the stone sealed the door of the tomb, they thought their brother was lost to them forever. But Jesus wanted to show that Lazarus was never lost to God. He wanted to show that there was no kind of darkness that could seal God out, no kind of death where Lazarus couldn't hear God speak his name, no kind of tomb from which God couldn't call him forth into new life. And that isn't true just for Lazarus. It's true for every person we think we've lost. And it's true for us as well. Right now, we don't know what's going to happen with the course of this pandemic. We don't know what's going to happen to those we're worried about because of this illness or for some other reason. We can do what we can to stay connected with phone calls and emails and video chats and good old-fashioned snail mail. We can pray for them and for ourselves and for all those working in healthcare and food service and grocery stores and delivery who would love to be able to seal themselves away in safety, but who can't. For their protection and for ours, we can wash our hands and touch only what we must and shop only when necessary and keep at least 6 feet away. These things we can do, just as I'm sure Martha and Mary did what they could do, tending to their brother at his sickbed, wiping his brow, spooning broth down his throat, and sending for Jesus to help. And sometimes what we do works. Sometimes we do see people get well when we never expected them to live. Sometimes we do see people suddenly wake up from addiction, or people who've been sunk into suicidal depression come back to life. Sometimes we do, but not every time. And for each of us, there will be one time when that doesn't happen, because for whatever reason, we all have to go through death, just as Lazarus did, just as Jesus did. There's no avoiding it. So what do we do then? Well, we weep, of course. We grieve. Even Jesus wept at the pain of grief. But then we let them go. Not into oblivion, but into the hands of God. Because the sign that Jesus gave us through Lazarus shows us that ultimately we don't need to worry about our loved ones, no matter what kind of tomb they're sealed inside. Lost though they may seem to us, they are not lost to God. And even if we can no longer hear their voices and they can no longer hear ours, they will always be able to hear God's voice. When God calls them by name, they will respond. So when the miracle doesn't happen for those we love, when all we get to see is the tomb and them sealed inside, the story of Lazarus tells us that they are still, at the most fundamental level, okay. They are still safely in God's hands. God will still call to them, and they will still be able to hear God's voice, as will we. No matter what kind of darkness surrounds us, no matter what kind of tomb we're sealed inside, God will always come to us and call us by name, summoning us safely into God's light, safely into God's light. Thanks be to God.